Simon Tay, Professor of Law at National University of Singapore and concurrently chairman of the Singapore Institute of International Affairs. He's had a long and distinguished career in public service and extremely varied. Head of the National Environment Agency. He's been a member of Parliament and in that capacity directed a number of public consultations. Familiar with the United States, has a master's from Harvard in law. To comment on his talk, which is entitled Southeast Asian Views of the U.S.-China Relationship, Benefiting from Economic Cooperation, Suffering from Geopolitical Competition, is Ernie Bauer. Ernie is presently Senior Advisor and Director of the CSIS, Center for Strategic International Studies Southeast Asia Program. He's had his own consulting firm dealing with Asia-Pacific matters, and for many years was head of the U.S.-ASEAN Business Council. So again, is very familiar with the area and the topic under discussion. So without further ado, Simon, the floor is yours, and Simon's going to stand up to take the floor.
Thank you, Doug. It's good to see you here after your time in Singapore. I want to thank the Kissinger Institute for inviting me. I should explain I'm standing up because of the time difference in Singapore. It's 3 a.m. So if I didn't stand up, I might fall asleep doing my own talk, which is, kind of bad. I got a relatively long paper, and I think the best thing to do is to read it very slowly and sonorously in the afternoon. But seriously, I'm just going to punch up a few points, and then really, I know with Ernie we can have a good discussion, and I think those of you who bothered to stay will provide your own inputs. The first thing I want to say is that talking about views from ASEAN or Southeast Asia, we have to deal with the diversity that the 10 small and medium-sized economies of ASEAN are not of one view about China nor about America, let alone the US-China relationship. In fact, this is one of the critical points I think I'll get to right at the end, that we have got to start thinking about common pillars. Otherwise, the ASEAN as a group will be in trouble if the US-China relationship runs either very hot or very cold. The second thing I'd say is that, connected to that, is that while I'm from Singapore, I will try to talk and give you some sense of the diversity of ASEAN views. But one thing they have in common, compared to everybody else who's spoken today, nobody in ASEAN is the ambition of being a great power or is in some sort of state of recovery over once having been a potential world power. When we say the word G2, they mean we are not included, we know that. And I think it makes a great difference in how we think about this relationship. And in that sense, I'd be I think the first one here to emphasize two words. First, well, not a word, a phrase, is that it's my belief, and I think most people in ASEAN see it this way, the US-China relationship is now the most important relationship in the world. Due apologies to every single other putative power out there, but it's really the thing we think most about now when it comes to our region and most of global issues. The second sort of word or phrase I'd like to punch up compared to what has gone before is about the post-crisis world. Maybe it relates to the fact I've written a book called Asia Alone, The Dangerous Post-Crisis Divide. Last year, it was my pleasure to be in America for the year at the Asia Society in New York. And really, the combination of being situated in America, reading, and trying to write about Asian affairs, really makes me see that the post-crisis world we're perceiving is very different. In Southeast Asia, we really feel the change of trajectory. That if before the crisis, America was doing well, so will we. Post-crisis or right now, we see America struggling. I mean, America will probably recover. I will not bet against America. But right now, we perceive a China and an Asia that's rising strongly and a China that is confidence bordering on hubris. And I think those are the kind of dynamics we've seen over the last year and a bit. And this makes a big difference to perception of China-US relations in our region. Right now and to the middle term, I think most of ASEAN, especially Singapore, my country, wants to keep America deeply engaged, We're concerned, however, about US distractions domestically, as Indonesia has witnessed with sort of 3 strikes and Obama is still not there. The other perception issue is that of strategic competition. And what do we non-powers think about it? Sort of being between. I've actually had an American thinker describe Southeast Asia as being between the USA and China. I don't think he meant geographically, so I think he must mean something else. And this perception of being between reminds me kind of the Asian saying about what happens to the grass when the buffaloes fight. Or in fact, when they also make love, the grass doesn't do very well. So it's kind of my version of the hot and cold issue. In that sense, I think that the recent ASEAN Regional Forum, which the Japanese speaker Takagi-san mentioned earlier, has been actually a very interesting signifier of perhaps a new phase of Southeast Asian perceptions of the rise of Chinese power. You'll remember back to 1993 in the Mischief Reef, great name, Mischief Reef, where we witnessed sort of Chinese ambitions. And since then, in those 17 years since then, we've been actually sort of much more assuaged by Chinese behavior since then. But this second round in the South China Sea, I think, will need to be seen. I think Clinton did speak for a lot of more voiceless Southeast Asians. But I think unlike, maybe like America, most Southeast Asians are waiting to see what China will do in response. A signal has been sent to Beijing in this sense, and we'll see how they respond. But on other issues, which China and US have between them, we're not actually sure where ASEAN or most of us should fall. Primarily, I would say, if I have an underlying theme, it is that most Southeast Asians are trying to refuse a dichotomous either-or choice and thinking about US and China. And therefore, I was actually very very assured by statements earlier on by Americans and others that said, it probably won't get too hot or too cold. That probably, by luck or otherwise, they'll manage somewhere in between. Strategically, economically, it doesn't make sense for the small countries of Southeast Asia to have to choose. Strategically and politically, obviously, we are much more comfortable with America as the presence we've been used to. And what Clinton did in the ERF is actually notable. What was equally notable, I think, was the complete absence of a US official in Hanoi as well, a couple of weeks later when we met for the economic ministers meeting. It's equally significant because even if the official had turned up, whether Ron Kirk turned out anything, I don't think he would have been given the right to say anything much positive. Because where we are right now is that economically, and that's the second strand of our relationship, I think that our sense of the US-China relationship and our relationship to both is clearly one of change. The facts speak for themselves. Briefly, Asia, including China, hubbed together to produce goods for the American and the G3 markets, Japan and Europe. But in this crisis, coming out of the crisis, we have been told and we are telling ourselves to be much more self-contained economy that can produce, consume among Asians. And in that gap of American domestic demand, we see China as the largest potential market to take up that slack of demand. And this means that we, in a sense, are becoming more self-contained in Asia, that Asia may be more economically alone, and centered around what some people have called the bamboo economy. Hopefully not a tributary system, but clearly an economy that's going to depend more on the Chinese market, increasingly, compared to the American market. I mean, these are relative shifts. I don't think we're going to sell more to China per se. So I've talked briefly about the political security power, where I think clearly we're more comfortable with America, we know, than a China which is rising, or perhaps some Chinese Pacific has risen. On the economic side, we clearly have hopes for the Chinese economy to keep pulling us along, whereas, sadly, the American economy doesn't look as if it can help Americans, let alone us. Let me move on to the soft power equation and simply say that here, my view, and I think most Asian views, ASEAN views, is that China does not have a soft power attraction to us. I mean, we're impressed by how quickly, economically, they pumped up the economy. We kind of envy that. But in terms of the soft power of being able to persuade us and show us, value system, etc., I think ASEAN is actually moving closer to America than you would imagine. Indonesia, particularly, which is a key player in ASEAN. But the group as a whole has signed a charter which talks about democracy, human rights, and good governance. I know it is more language than reality when the group includes Myanmar, but I think it is important change of values and or at least of declaratory values. In this sense, really these three poles, security, politics, economics, and soft power, really show how the region is kind of divided up and unwilling, not just maybe even not unwilling, but unable to choose starkly between one or the other. Let me shift on to my next point, which is the relationship between China and ASEAN. I think this sometimes stands on the verge of being misunderstood by Americans, because I've said that we are not large powers, and therefore sometimes Americans think that China will come to dominate the region, just as America after World War II did. And I think that's overstated. Clearly, in these last 17 years since Mischief Reef, China has put in a multi-pronged, long-term effort to win friends and influence Southeast Asia. In the wonderful language of journalists, they said this is a charm offensive, not an armed offensive. But I think while they have softened those edges of contention and historical distrust about communist China, nobody is in the pocket of China. Even take some of the worst-case scenarios. I say Cambodia, a small state, a rather repressive regime under Hun Sen, though elected. Its National Assembly Hall was paid for by China. I think its airport was too. But they have shown some adroitness in trying to reach out more to America. The question is whether Americans are paying attention. For example, let's take official development assistance, ODA. Globally, America still, despite all its problems, gives out much more than China. But in Cambodia, the last time I looked, the Chinese give out about 3 to 4 times as much as the Americans do. So it's very targeted, focused at winning friendships in Cambodia. The same picture is relatively true across ASEAN. And so we see that China really has been trying to influence friends, soften its competitive friction through things like a free trade agreement, which kicks in this year. A side point for those of you who know that the FTA will actually bring together the world's largest market. When it was supposed to kick in this year, Indonesia, the largest Southeast Asian country, had some question marks because it's got various vested interests, some of whom, of course, consult for Ernie probably. And the Chinese reaction was very interesting. Rather sort of thump the table and say, no, you signed this, it's going to enforce this year. The Chinese actually have taken the time to try to talk to those Indonesian industries and see what issues they have and come back to soften some of the language if need be. So this again shows that how China negotiates the region is always quite aware of the interests or concerns, legitimate or otherwise, of these smaller and medium-sized countries. Having said that, let me talk quickly about ASEAN, the group as a whole, in terms of 3 roles it plays. 1 is of a host, 2 is of its own integrated market, and 3 is as a normative community. I think both China, certainly, and belatedly America under Obama have come to understand ASEAN's role in Asia as a host. When I was at Asia Society, recognition of China was 1, 2, 3 times. Then 4th time you think about India, and ASEAN not at all. I think that the Obama regime, administration, has changed this quite fundamentally. Its willingness to engage with ASEAN. We're going to have the 2nd US-ASEAN summit this week. The willingness to sign on to the East Asia Summit, which is hosted by ASEAN. I mean, there's not actually much substance in the summit at this point in time. I wouldn't have advised signing that, but they have, and they're going to try to make it grow. ASEAN has been criticized often of being a talk shop. Therefore, it's very interesting that from the start, Secretary of State Clinton and the others have taken ASEAN seriously. Now it's a question of ASEAN, whether we ourselves can hold it up. That's my second point. that ASEAN as a united, integrated market is still struggling. It does need help from outsiders. It does need help to move ahead with its ASEAN Economic Community and its charter. And I think in that sense, the US engagement of ASEAN, just as China's engagement of ASEAN, can help. The third part, which is often not talked about at all, is ASEAN as a normative community. What I mean by this is that despite its weaknesses as a political player or as an economic market or entity, ASEAN, I think, has been the one to put forward various norms of cooperation and peace that apply not only to ASEAN, but to the wider region. And I think here, in the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation and other treaties started by ASEAN, it is where America and China can help support this by accepting it, as America has this year, and helping these institutions like the ASEAN Regional Forum go forward. So ASEAN does need, in a sense, support. Its role in Asia, in the wider Asia, is kind of a default leadership, not because it's the strongest, but precisely because it's relatively weak but trusted. I think I should close off quite soon, Doug, because I'm running out of time, and I want to leave more time for Ernie and the discussion. But I think one point I must touch upon is that while I've tried to signal where we are and where I hope we'll go, that ASEAN can remain united, can remain relevant to not only its members, but to the wider Asia and America, there are challenges. We've talked a lot about the US-China tensions, but one thing I'd really try to touch upon is the domestic politics of both the US and China. In my book, Asia Alone, The Dangerous Post-Crisis Divide, I credit the Obama administration with trying to engage with Asia. And I think, hopefully my remarks, though brief here, have done the same. But while the spirit of the presidency of Obama is willing, I think the body politic is distracted and indeed absent. And you look at the Indonesia visit. It is not just a sentimental reason of his youth that I think Obama should visit Indonesia. Indonesia is the epicenter of ASEAN. It's a critical player. It's a democracy. It's the most populous Muslim country in the world. It's economically too close. There are a couple of dozen things that Obama should put strategically on the table with Indonesia. And as far as I know, a strategic framework agreement has already been more or less done. But he didn't turn up 3 times for all very good reasons. The job summit, health care, oil spill in Louisiana. He had to take care of these things or face domestic backlash. But the outcome of this is that the actual symbolism and engagement with the strategically important part of Southeast Asia, Indonesia, has been incomplete. And this week, a small price is being paid when Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, the president of Indonesia, basically declined to come to the second US summit. So it's a very weird summit. You're going to have 2 leaders missing. One is of the Myanmar generals, which is a good thing because it'll be hard for the US president. And the other is the most progressive democracy of Southeast Asia, which is kind of a loss. And more broadly speaking, I think as we come into the midterm elections in America, one of the reasons I'm delighted to be here in DC is to try to get a reading of that. How much of that Tea Party flavor is going to actually make it very hard for America to engage meaningfully with a rising Asia. And how easy it might be for the rising Asia to think, okay, if they're not interested, we're going alone. That's not just a political statement. That primarily, I think, is an economic issue. The inability of America to seriously talk about an FTA with ASEAN when just about everybody else in Asia has one. I think that's going to hurt America in the medium to long term. Domestic politics also applies to China. One of the reasons we are concerned about China is not their leadership. I think their leaders, their diplomats have been the most reticent to claim Chinese power or distributed system. But if you read the netizens and the blogs and the common sentiment of China, I think a lot of us feel that these last 2 years have seen a change. And therefore, the future power holders of China, I think that's where some of the region has some question marks. Not necessarily cynicism about Chinese power, but question marks. So I would say that where we are is that we have to remain one ASEAN to keep some sort of community among ourselves, to find some common pillars in dealing with China and the USA. But the second, and this is the fate of all groupings of smaller countries, is that the really important thing, what America and Americans think of China, what Chinese and the Chinese government, how they react to America, these remain out of our hands. We'll just have to live the consequences.
Simon, thank you very much for those really extraordinarily thoughtful comments. Ernie?
Thank you, Simon. And I agree. Those were very thoughtful comments. I sign up to most of that. I mean, who could argue with when talking about ASEAN's perspective of China and the U.S.-China relationship with someone with your experience and position. But a couple of things I'd like to point out that really struck me from what you said. I think I take your point as correct that ASEAN does view the U.S.-China relationship as the most important relationship in the world. It's interesting then to think about what ASEAN's role is, and you sort of described it as between, and how to figure out, how is ASEAN between China and the U.S. I sort of see ASEAN as possibly a fulcrum, sort of a balancing point between the United States and China, and I think American strategists are starting to get their arms around this idea. And the idea is something like this, and you can see it in the preparation that's going on within the U.S. government ahead of our entering a regional security architecture, joining the East Asian Summit, ahead of the ASEAN, the U.S. joining the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting +8, and hopefully ahead of what would eventually be a trade policy in the United States, although no politician of late has had the courage to push forward and actually articulate a vision for trade. I think that's got to come, or we won't probably recover the way we should. And I think in this sense you can see that the United States is starting to pin down the key steps, the key pillars of a strong relationship with ASEAN, because they believe, and I believe this is true, ASEAN is going to be the foundation upon which this regional architecture is built, the East Asia Summit. So if you have a weak ASEAN, a split ASEAN, as you correctly note in your comments, it's by nature it's going to be very difficult to have one ASEAN view. But the leaders in ASEAN, I think, were very prescient in outlining a plan for integrating ASEAN in the ASEAN Charter politically, economically, and socially and culturally. And that plan seems to many to be very ambitious. But for those of us who worked on ASEAN for years, I guess I'm 25 years in now, I do see progress over time towards a common ASEAN vision, and I believe that you can apply Moore's law to ASEAN, change in ASEAN, which means that it things sort of speed up incrementally faster as time goes on. I don't know what the exact coefficient is going to be on that. What strikes me too is that as I look at American and Chinese views of ASEAN, I quite agree with your point, Simon, and I think you aptly put your fingers on the pulse of what's happening in the United States. There's a gap, and I just wrote about this on the CSIS blog this morning. There's a gap between American policy towards Southeast Asia and the political value we assign to Southeast Asia. In other words, Kurt Campbell and Jeff Bader and Secretary Gates and Secretary Clinton, the Asia policy team knows the importance of Southeast Asia to the United States. They know it's our fourth largest market. They know that we have important strategic interests there. They know we have two treaty allies within ASEAN. They know that the key navigational lanes, sea lanes, exist in this region. No question. But politically, Americans, as you correctly pointed out, don't think about ASEAN. They don't know where it is. They don't know that American jobs are heavily dependent on the growth of this region that's one of the most trade-dependent regions in the world. I think trade is roughly equal to about 100% of GDP. And that's a gap. When I look over at China, I see a much more aligned, actually, I was saying I would see much more alignment between policymakers and Chinese politics. But I liked your point because I think the point of this idea of you didn't put it this neatly, but I'll put words in your mouth. The idea that there are two Chinas, at least two, a China that says what can China do. And those are the people that are really feeling this surge of strength and power and enablement that would rightly come with the world's now second largest economy sort of feeling its oats. And I think it also extends, unfortunately, to the People's Liberation Army and some of the statements that have come out of there, as well as the netizens that we see in China, and they're asking, how far can China go? And I think you get a real feeling of sort of a Monroe Doctrine sense of attitude towards Southeast Asia by that group. And then there's the Deng Xiaopingists who kind of look at Southeast Asia and they look at the world and they think about building a strong China, and then they think about what should China do. So it's the what can China do group versus the what should China group do, and I think that's an interesting dynamic that sort of impacts this relationship. I think, talking to Southeast Asians, my view is that one of the common threads in their view as they look at China is that, and I quite agree with your construct that on the economic front, China offers great new dynamism. I was in the room for the East. Or the ASEAN Plus 3 summit in Indonesia a couple of years ago, and all the Asian leaders were there. There was no U.S. official there. There was an audience of about 500 business people from all around Asia, and the Japanese leader came in and he said, "We are giving aid to the region, and we are going to continue to stay engaged, and we're one of the biggest investors." And there was respectful applause. The Korean leader came up and talked about security issues in North Korea, and there was maybe a little less applause. And when Wen Jiabao walked in the room, everybody stood up and gave him a standing ovation before he said anything. And I thought, wow, this is something's going on here. But the reason was that there's a real expectation among Southeast Asians that China will add a real engine to Asian economic integration and Asian growth. And I think, and they're rightly excited about it. And I think from an American policy point of view, we should not fight that, because that's sort of a force of nature, in my view. We should be part of it. And that's why I really think that I couldn't agree more that we've got to get back on the track and get involved in a trade agreement with ASEAN, as hard as that would be. I think creative minds could bracket off Burma for now, and you could build in a capacity building element for the lesser developed ASEAN countries. But we have to get in this game, and to me, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, does not get us there. On the geopolitical side, I think the real common thread, in my view, in talking to ASEAN leaders and businessmen, is there's a real question of sort of innate antibodies towards China that are embedded in Southeast Asia, and that's really got to do with the fact that China is an enormous country with a lot of new power that's right on top of them. And so if that was the United States, I think you'd have the same sort of uncertainty and fear and anxieties. Maybe fear isn't the right word. Anxieties about what are these guys all about, and what are their plans. And I think those antibodies are what sort of keeps China's soft power in check, as you put in your paper. I think he said no one in Asia wants to be China, which I think it's right. I mean, in terms of politically, that's true. Economically, I can tell you a lot of them want to be China. So that is the split. I think I'll stop there. I really appreciated your comments and you coming all the way and fighting through the jet lag to make the presentation.
You just go by yourself, though.
Anyway, thank you very much for your comments.
Well, thank you, Ernie, for your comments as well. I think the floor is open for questions, and I see several. Yes, Fyodor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Simon, for this introduction. Very refreshing, I would say. The notion of a complete shift of American attendance to Asia, which is common wisdom in Russia. Now, after your presentation, I would research more on that. my question is, I'm intrigued by your words about normative power of ASEAN, because we know very well from our experience what does normative power mean in the case of European Union, because in European Union there's actually the only foreign policy instrument they used to have and still has. Now it works a little bit differently than before, but still. As I understand, the normative power of ASEAN is completely different by nature. Can you elaborate more on that, how it will be produced?
Should I answer that now or
Yes.
take several?
I think go ahead.
Yeah.
One-on-one.
I think that, when we think of the EU's normative power, we think of sort of EU values, democracy, human rights, etc. I think that the formulation of what ASEAN stands for will be slightly different. If you look at the Charter, it does talk about integrated markets, development that will try to even out ASEAN's growth. I mean, we have very rich countries like Singapore and Brunei, and we have in Laos GDP per capita that's sub-Saharan Africa as low as that. So we do have these discrepancies in ASEAN, and the effort of the ASEAN community is to try to address these economic, social issues, as well as I mentioned human rights, democracy, and good governance. And we've created now a Human Rights Commission, though not as anything powerful as it might one hope to be. It is still a small step in this direction. So I think internally, for its 10 members, ASEAN is trying to create this kind of normative community. And one of them, of course, is not to have anything but peaceful settlement disputes. We sometimes bump up against the realities of old rivalries like Cambodia-Thai border, but we have so far not really gone to war with each other. Now, more broadly, I think if those things can be brought to the ASEAN Regional Forum and elsewhere, I think this board starts to get to what I mean by a normative community. What does this mean for the US and China? I think sometimes it means that on certain issues, we will think that, America is right. And we will start to tell China, as in South China Sea, in our own way, that there are various concerns we have which are being raised. On the other hand, and this part might be hard for America to accept, there may be other times where we think, actually, I think this is not an issue that America should be raising at this time with China or the rest of Asia. One might be too much browbeating about, currencies. I mean, not to say the yuan is where it should be for our sake. The Vietnamese, for example, have, I think, devalued the dong about 3 times so far, partly because of pressures from the cheaper and cheaper yuan, or the weakening dollar. But it does mean that we think that in terms of the way to do it, it may not be the best way to go about getting a result. So I guess this is what I mean by me and a few others, I think, about ASEAN as a normative community. Right now, I think most people say it's just a talk shop, but I think it's going to have to move to this normative community in order to be of any use to the wider region.
Way in the back.
I am Patricio Abinales of the Asia. I'm one of the fellows of the Asia program. I'd like Mr. Tai to comment on 2 things. One is that the closeness between ASEAN and China also has something to do with the fact that a lot of the big businesses in Southeast Asia, they are owned by diasporic Chinese. So Sino-Thai, Filipino-Thai, Indonesian, Chinese Indonesians have closer ties to South China. You have nothing comparable in America. The Asian American community is not really a big economic presence in the country. Not only are they more, domestically interested, they're not interested in trading with China. So that, I think, is something that might be factored in. Now, on the negative side, I think I'd like Mr. Tai to comment on the fact that China also plays a very big role in the thriving informal economy in Southeast Asia. You go to northern Thailand, you get the latest coffee maker or the latest DVD machine, pirated DVDs from China. Chinese prostitutes are all over Orchard Road in Singapore. And in southern Philippines, they sell a Chinese version of Viagra. So how would ASEAN and China then deal with this thriving informal economy? Thank you.
Do you want me to answer that?
Yeah, it's all yours, Simon.
I was just trying to figure out whether you want to group the questions or just take them or get Ernie back in. Or first, I think we should not overrate the overseas Chinese factor. I'm one of them, obviously. But we in Singapore are very cautious of not becoming seen as a Chinese state. So, for example, in Singapore, the number of flights you can take to China are very many, but actually you can take more flights per day to India. So we've tried to position ourselves very much as a global city, of which 3/4 are Chinese, but not as a Chinese city like Shanghai or even Hong Kong. And I think that the position of many overseas Chinese diaspora in Indonesia, in Bangkok, in Malaysia is even more so. There's great political sensitivities. So I don't agree that the overseas Chinese firms are presently a large political factor. I think clearly at the start of the Chinese openness to investment, they play a significant role in the sort of periphery helping change the Chinese mainland. And today they still play a role. Like, for example, if you go to Shanghai and you throw a stone, you probably hit a Taiwanese entrepreneur, which you may or may not want to do. But to think that they have a political strength back in Taiwan, I don't think that's true. Now, if you don't take the overseas the Chinese Americans, or you take Chinese multinationals, not race, but simply the economic interest in the Chinese market, I think they have been the greatest factor in sort of smoothing over the frictions in the U.S.-China relationships. People like Ernie Bauer, when he was in ASEAN, and his compatriots who were doing the China work, I think those people are really, in a way, kind of ambassadors for China. And so, for me...
U.S. multinationals, not Chinese multinationals.
Yeah, American multinationals, yeah, interested in China. That's why, for me, one of the signals I've been looking at in the last few months has sort of the Jeff Immelt change. If Jeff Immelt and Eric Schmidt of Google and GE and Google in that order start to criticize Chinese market and their treatment there, I think much more than Tibet, or maybe added with Tibet, this is the kind of thing that might tip U.S.-China relations in a bad way. And so the other thing about the Chinese prostitutes, I don't think it's particularly Chinese. Singapore, Orchard Road, you can find every prostitute from everywhere. Russians, you can find, I can offend everybody in the room here quite easily. But the broader question of the informal economy, I think it goes back to how much we're trying to actually regulate and able to regulate. Some countries do feel some sensitivities about it, obviously, when it's illegal, like, for example, the drugs spilling out from Myanmar or China or somewhere. But on the whole, I think there is a certain level of comfort because there's kind of historical ties anyway. What I think is the more interesting factor is the direct trade, which China wisely started to value in yuan. So I think there's a small experiment going on between Thailand and China of valuing that direct trade in renminbi rather than having to intermediate through the US dollar.
I would just add, I take it from your accent that you might be from the Philippines. And I would actually say that, and I don't know if Simon would agree, but I agree with his answer to your question. But I would say that in the Philippines, I actually do find that the Philippines is a bit of an outlier on that issue. And I would agree with your where your question is coming from on the Philippines. The Chinese Filipinos have actually played a very much more proactive role in working on the China-Philippine relationship than anywhere else in ASEAN. So
True.
I do see that there.
Yes, ma'am.
I actually have a question specifically about Singapore more than ASEAN. So, correct me if I'm wrong, but Singapore has maybe shaped its policies drastically these couple of years, maybe this decade, to stir itself towards China more than the Western. I'm actually thinking of a specific example and about Singapore to not use to advocate Chinese education, but because Lee Kuan Yew was not Chinese educated. I might be wrong. So, but maybe a past decade or two when China's starting to get stronger, they advocate Chinese education more. And I have a couple of Singaporeans friends who told me that they hate learning Mandarin, but because now it's compulsory, you have to learn because China is strong and it's very important to learn Chinese. So I was wondering about Singapore's policy about, stuff like that. All right.
Well, Singapore's relation to China actually have gone through different phases. You remember the communist threat, so-called communist threat and emergency in Singapore, Malaysia. So from that time into I would say, the 70s, there was a lot of concern about Chinese influence. But throughout all that time, Chinese education was already there. And it was actually, second language education in Chinese was already valued by many people. And we actually had universities at that time in Chinese. Today, however, Singapore's universities and schools are all in English. But we have strong second language components. So if you're Chinese, like my son has to learn Chinese. But if you're Indian, you have to learn Tamil or another Indian language. Or you're Malay, you have to learn Bahasa. So it is more of a sort of equal policy. I would say, actually, the perception of shift might be of relative. I mean, because, again, in the 70s, Singapore really was part of the Western multinational platform base. That was our niche in the world. When China was closed, when India was closed, and everyone was talking about import substitution, Singapore was probably the only person looking for multinationals, and they were predominantly Western and Japanese. But since then, with the opening of China and India, we've gone into Asia. We've come to realize, not regret, that we're part of Asia. At one point, some Singaporeans said, wouldn't it be nice to be a little island off the American coast? Then they realized that's Hawaii, and they're not doing so well. So we've actually come to value our role. But in my book, Asia Alone, I try to talk about what I call the power of and. Because really, Singapore tries to be a city where Indians, we get Indian diaspora, Indian multinationals coming in. We try to get Chinese to some settled, but we remain one of the largest overseas contingents in Singapore is American, and the U.S. fleet comes in regularly. We're one of the major posts for them to come through and have logistics and other things, maybe including the prostitutes on Orchard Road, while they are in Singapore. So we try to be, I wouldn't use the word equidistant because it sounds like you're distant from everyone, and we're not neutral, but we're trying to be equiproximate to everyone. And that's why the U.S.-China relationship, if it's on a fairly even keel, we can profit from both sides. But if it goes bad, we'll have trouble.
Equiproximate. I'm going to put that in my vocabulary.
It's in my book.
Yeah, I see. Good.
T-shirts are on sale outside.
I see. Good. All right. Mike?
Thanks. I'm Mike Fonte. I work as the Washington liaison for Taiwan's DPP, but I'm not going to ask about Taiwan. I'm interested that on Friday, Undersecretary Hormat spoke and underscored the TPP quite significantly. And as somebody who goes to a lot of these kind of conferences, I've heard other officials that seems to be one of the talking points. So I wonder what your perspective, as my understanding, Singapore is currently part of the TPP. Is that correct? And Brunei and some other, New Zealand. What's your view of trying to enlarge that as a trade organization that, I mean, my understanding is you've got ASEAN plus 1, ASEAN plus 3. That leaves the United States on the outside looking in. We want to be in, and that seems like the TPP is a way that, not to talk about an FTA, we wouldn't call it an FTA because that wouldn't fly here. But I just wonder what your experience is both with it and what you think of a future for that.
Yeah. I was an advisor to our Ministry of Trade and Industry, and we think, I mean, quite unofficially, we'd say that Singapore was the father of the TPP. We pushed it. I mean, Brunei didn't push it. We pushed it and brought in the New Zealanders and the Chileans and added up the Bruneians. So when Secretary of Commerce Kirk was in Singapore for APEC CEO Summit, and he spoke because Obama was still in Tokyo, and he announced that we're going to negotiate the TPP. He got a spontaneous round of applause, very strong support for the idea that America is willing to talk about trade with anyone in Asia. So you pick your format. If TPP makes sense to you because you can bring in Vietnam but also Australia, then we're happy. But it's complicated. TPP will not be easy if you keep setting up the bench so high. So what Ernie and I think clearly both of us agree is that something should be done with ASEAN. It need not be called an FTA, especially since Ernie's point is that, like if it Laos and Cambodia, you need more development assistance than anything else. So a TIFA or some other, but you need some sort of economic handle on the US-ASEAN relationship. Otherwise, as we approach, the second summit now and then next year the third, if it's just about politics and statements, it's not going to go far enough.
Yeah, I would just add, Taiwan's got an issue here because Simon and I were talking before this that we presented today, and we said, both of us are. Can I share this? I don't know if you shared that privately or not. But I argued recently that unless APEC gets its act together, the APEC Leaders Summit is not going to continue eventually, and probably in the near term, because the U.S. is entering this East Asia Summit, and there's only so much time for leaders. And I made this argument. We were together in KL at a conference like this, a little broader. And the first person that came up to the podium was the Taiwanese gentleman and said, "What are you talking about? I mean, what are we going to do with Taiwan? If you do the East Asian Summit, Taiwan is not part of the ASEAN 10+8 that comprises the ASEAN Summit or the East Asian Summit. And if the leaders don't meet at APEC, you're sub-optimizing Taiwan. And then if you go to the TPP, we're also not a member of the TPP. So in security architecture or regional architecture in general, and on trade architecture, would you please rethink about this and think about a place for Taiwan? And I think that's an important question that the United States should consider, and Taiwan, I'm sure, is focused on.
Just to conclude on that point, Singapore is now going to negotiate an FTA. I mean, it's not confirmed, but more than likely to have an FTA with Taiwan. This question was actually raised under the DPP administration, and we walked away from it. But I think with ECFA in place now, I think it's likely to happen. And after Singapore signs, perhaps ASEAN will come in as well.
We have another question way in the back.
Hi, Joshua Lipes from Radio Free Asia. I was wondering, as America tries to, increase its role in Southeast Asia, how do you think the U.S. may weigh in on Chinese territorial claims? I guess I'm speaking specifically about the Spratlys and Paracels.
Want to go first?
I think that, as I mentioned, I think Secretary Clinton's statement was welcome. But the idea that America could solve it for all of us, I think that has to be put to one side. I think what we have to look for, consistent with my argument about normative community, is to resolve this by international law, by peaceful means, and to look at, it's not the motherhood and apple pie, I know, but, joint development. And while preserving various freedoms, like freedom of navigation for everyone. Because those sea lanes are vital, not just to China or America, but for Japan, Korea, and supply of, almost everything through that region. Some of the busiest shipping lanes in the world go through there and then to the Malacca Straits. So I'm hoping that the American statement will send some signal to the Chinese. And if you pick up what a number of people have been saying about the voices in China itself, and Ernie's point about the PLA against, the citizen leadership, I think hopefully this will kind of contain certain ambitions by the navies or on each side. I mean, similarly, I think some of the ASEAN navies have also been reinforcing their claims in the South China Sea, which is not behavior I recommend. Singapore is not claiming to anything. And I think after this signal, we have to wait for what Beijing will say. And secondly, I think some of us have to go out of our way to make an effort. So Singapore, for example, has offered itself as a bridge or broker between the rest of ASEAN and China. Our foreign minister has just made that offer in a trip to China last week, or the week before.
You know, I just to add to this, I think what Hillary Clinton said at Hanoi at the ARF was not significantly new from anything we've said before. What I think really shocked the Chinese foreign minister was the fact that so many other voices who were in the room at the ARF meeting, not only ASEAN but others around the room, got up and supported it, and were obviously had been talked to and were supportive. And I think the fact that the Chinese reaction was so stark really did cause a lot of concern in the region about what this wasn't some gauntlet thrown down in Hanoi. It was sort of a statement of diplomatic motherhood and apple pie. Let's resolve disputes multilaterally according to the rule of law. And I don't think the Americans were suggesting that they would come in and try to adjudicate minute issues on specific islands. That was not the intent of what the Secretary said. So it's really interesting. I think China, I felt like China has pulled back and has started to recalibrate a little bit the foreign minister's strong reaction. And you can see that in a lot of areas. One that was really interesting this morning, I had a call from a good friend of mine, Carl Thayer, who was writing an article, and he said the editor sent this article back to him because the Chinese swear that they never said that the South China never said to the Americans that the South China Sea was a core interest of China, and he had stated that in an article that he was trying to get published, and he said, can you prove to me that happened and where? And it's a pretty interesting question, and I think this is going to also be interesting on North Korea and Burma. Will there eventually be sort of a cost to China's role as responsible stakeholder in its profile and its ability to extend its influence in the role that it's playing in those two countries? Sort of recently, I don't know if you caught this, but the Tan Shui, the leader of Burma, went to China and sort of seemingly got sort of a free pass, and actually a proactive statement by the Chinese that let the Burmese elections go as they will, stay out of it. It's a Chinese, or I mean, it's a Burmese Freudian slip. It's a Burmese internal issue, and I wondered, how's that going to go down in Southeast Asia, where the Southeast Asians are pinned with the tail on the donkey, and then that's Burma, and it's been a real problem for them. It has a real cost to them, and to have the Chinese sort of aiding and abetting in that, I think eventually there'll be a cost associated with it.
Yes, Norman.
Norman Fu. I'm with the China Times of Taipei. My question is for Mr. Tay. It's a two-part question about your senior minister, Lee Kuan-yew.
Mentor minister.
Singapore and Mr. Lee played a crucial role in bringing Taiwan, the mainland China, together to have the first round of talks back in '93. However, after Lee Teng-hui became the president, his relationship with Lee Teng-hui, his namesake, soured. And on various occasions, Mr. Lee has warned Taiwan not to seek independence. And he warned about the disastrous consequences if Taiwan should do so. So the first part of my question is, can you enlighten us as to what Mr. Lee ultimately wants to see happening between Taiwan and the mainland? That seems sometimes to suggest maybe he's ultimately for reunification between the two parts of China. I don't know. I'd like to seek your opinion on this. Secondly, Mr. Lee is already in his late 70s. I mean 80s.
87, actually.
87.
Yeah.
So there have been suggestions that he may not forever be with us. So with your
Headline.
with your indulgence, I'd like to know, after his departure, what will happen to Singapore, because this man has a tremendous impact
easy one.
on Singapore. He's provided the clean, efficient government, although the Western press has criticized this as being sort of paternalistic and even autocratic. So after his departure, you think things will change? Politically, the country will liberalize a little more? So this is my two-part question about the senior minister. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I can't pretend to neutrality when I answer this question.
Yes.
I should confess that when I was a member of parliament, I was what they call a nominated member, an independent member, and you're supposed to debate the government. And I think Mr. Lee Kuan Yew referred to me by name twice in various debates, and both times disagreed with me. And I had the temerity to rebut him after he, rejoinder him after he rebutted my speeches. So I'm not necessarily sort of a true blue party supporter. I'm not a member of the ruling party, etc. Now, yet, I would say that Lee Kuan Yew has played a very interesting role for Singapore. And the easy one to answer, I think, is, what the hopes of both Lee Kuan Yew and I think most of the people of Singapore will be after he departs, whenever that might be. And it's that the so-called Singapore idea, meritocracy, non-corruption, economic growth, and relative inclusive, growth in Singapore, the middle class or something, that will remain. And in that sense, the good environment, clean air, and all those other things that he has helped build should be a reason why Singapore, as an Asian city, is quite different from a lot of what we see around us. And it's been kind of a model for some efforts to literally clean up other Asian cities and parts of Asia. But I think your finger is on the other one, the question of democracy and liberalization. And I think even Lee Kuan Yew himself has said Singapore could do with some dirt. It doesn't mean physical dirt, but a bit of a messier system. And this coming election, the PAP, I think, are going to be satisfied with less of a victory. I mean, Singapore elections are great things. Everyone knows who they won before you even start. That's why we all spend our time talking about international issues, because there's nothing much to talk about domestic politics. But I think that there will be some leavening of the political system after his departure. To American friends, I said, always remember when George Washington was around, there was no opposition, there was no other party. It took 3 presidents of America before there was a two-party system. And Singapore is now onto its 3rd prime minister. Lee Kuan Yew is still alive, and it's his son. So I think it will take some time. The system isn't broke, so we haven't fixed it. But I think it will evolve. The broader question, I think, is what he plays the role in the region. And I think it's been interesting. You mentioned the Taiwan role. I think we shouldn't overstate it. I think the countries, the representatives at the time wanted to meet, and they had to just find somebody. And the fact that we have not played a role, I think, is quite comfortable for us. We don't want to necessarily interject ourselves if it's not wanted. But recently, I would say another statement while Lee Kuan Yew was in Washington, D.C. last year got us into a bit of trouble with mainland, because he said, we wish America to remain in Asia because we need you to balance China. And he said to Americans that if you want to be a truly great country, to recover to where you were before the crisis, you must be in the Pacific, economically and politically. I think that's a very good statement, and I had to defend him in Beijing because netizens took offense to the word balancing China, This is my point about the netizens. He didn't use the word contain or keep China, under you or whatever. But even the word balance, for some reason, people said, we thought Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore was our friend. Why would you want to balance against your friend? And I think I've been trying to be honest, and so has Lee Kuan Yew, that we respect China. We think that China has a place in the world. It's coming up as it has been held back for so long. But the nature of Chinese power as it goes up cannot be taken for granted. Now, I'll go a little further than Lee Kuan Yew. Lee Kuan Yew always talks about America as being, very beneficial to everyone. In the presence of American friends, I'll say, you have been to us, but I can see from other third world views why American power sometimes has been, about your own national interests, not just for the global good all the time. And so in that sense, I would defend American existence and presence and hope for it, continued presence in Asia, Not because you've really been, everyone's best friend, but simply because this is a system which we understand, which we've almost all benefited from. And that Asia really has been growing precisely because a number of us have started to learn various lessons and engage with West and America the way you've taught us to. And I would say that a lot of Chinese thinkers I know also see this, that China has gone through its tutelage. They wouldn't be in the WTO except for America. They wouldn't be in the UN Security Council except for America. And I think that if Asians understand this, they will want to keep America engaged as long as possible, and even long after Lee Kuan Yew passes.
We will now stand and sing the national anthem. Simon, thank you very much. Ernie, thank you very much.
A pleasure.
Join me.
That was fun.
Everybody can stretch, but you can't leave, because we're going to start in just a minute when we get things shifted here. Sit down again. They'll go on forever.
Waiting for you to
All right.
close the door.
Good.
Thank you. Is Doug taking good care of you today?
He is, and with you now, I'm in very safe hands.
Could I invite everyone to take your seats, please, and let's get started with the last panel.
Undoubtedly, what I'm going to do is be very boring.
Yeah, right. Sorry, I don't speak Chinese. I'm not comfortable. But I'm much more comfortable with Bahasa Indonesia. You'll be Asia, okay.
Saving the best for last.
All right. Oh, Hawaii. Yeah. Okay. I'm speaking this year in Yokohama. How are you leaving? I leave on Wednesday. If you read the short, take a look at
For our last panel today, before we have some concluding comments, we shift to the subcontinent and the view from India of the U.S.-China relationship. To talk about this topic, we have, again, two noted experts. Professor Brahma Chelani is a professor of strategic studies at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi. He has served on the policy advisory group headed by the foreign minister and also was an advisor to India's National Security Council. He's a frequent contributor to various Indian and international publications. He's no stranger to America, has spent time at Harvard and Brookings and Johns Hopkins. To comment on his remarks, we're very pleased that Bob Hathaway could join us today. His Asia program, he directs the Asia program here at the Wilson Center, is actually one of our co-sponsors today. Bob's been here for over 10 years, a pillar of the establishment, this establishment, sorry. And before that, served for many years on the professional staff of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Representatives. So we're delighted to have both of you here. Professor Chelani.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's always very difficult to speak in the last session because everything has been said. And yet I'm sure the organizers of this conference won't let me go home without saying something new to you. So I will make an effort. We have a distinguished discussant, and I'm glad that Bob will be able to catch my omissions and mistakes. Let me begin with the bigger Asian scene and then come specifically to the U.S.-China relationship, which is the theme of this conference. But as the Deputy Secretary of State said in the morning, that you can't really look at the U.S.-China relationship without looking at the larger Asian landscape. Asia has come a long way, as can be seen by reading Gunnar Myrdal's 1968 book, The Asian Drama, in which the Swedish economist, who later went on to win the Nobel Prize, bemoaned how poverty, population pressures, and resource constraints were weighing down Asia. Today's Asian drama is not about poverty. There's still many poor people in Asia. Today's Asian drama is about high GDP growth rates. In fact, with the world's fastest growing economies, but also the fastest rising military expenditures, the most dangerous hotspots, and the fiercest resource competition found anywhere in the world, Asia is all set to shape the future direction of the global order. Yet Asia's problems are also pretty conspicuous. They are underlined by, for example, the increasingly fervent nationalism, the harmful historical legacies that weigh down all major interstate relationships in Asia. Then you have festering territorial and maritime disputes in Asia. And you also have various diverse and negative trans-border trends ranging from terrorism and illicit refugee flows. The important point to remember is that while Asia is becoming more interdependent economically, it is not coming together politically. In fact, Asia is becoming more divided politically, something that we often miss out. And when you contrast Asia with Europe, one thing stands out. The bloody wars that were fought in Europe in the first half of the 20th century have made war unthinkable in Europe. In contrast, the wars that were fought in Asia in the second half of the 20th century did not resolve disputes, but only sowed the seeds of greater interstate rivalries. And since 1950, which was the year the Korean War started, also the year the annexation of Tibet began, since 1950, a number of wars were fought in Asia. And significantly, China has been involved in the largest number of military conflicts. The recent Pentagon report on China has given examples of how, in the name of strategic defense, China carried out military preemption in 1950, in 1962, in 1969, in 1979. You can also add 1974 to that list, the capture of the Paracel Islands. Now, all these examples, cases of military preemption, happened when China was weak, poor, and internally troubled. So today, China's rapidly accumulating power does raise legitimate concerns in Asia and beyond. However, there is an important difference between the rise of China and the rises of other powers in world history, whether the rise of Japan, the rise of Germany, the rise of the United States. For example, when Japan rose as a world power during the Meiji era in the second half of the 19th century, rest of Asia was in decline. The Chinese, Indian, Korean civilizations were all in decline. After all, by the 19th century, much of Asia had been colonized by Europeans. So there was no other Asian power that could rein in Japan. Japan's rise opened the path to imperial conquest. Today, China is rising when other Asian states are also rising. In fact, there's never been a strong China, a strong Japan, and a strong India at the same time in history before. To some extent, I would say that China's expansionist impulses, the expansionist impulses of a rising power, are checkmated by other Asian powers to some extent. Militarily, China has no capacity to forcibly grab territories it claims. Still, with its defense spending having grown almost twice as fast as its GDP, China is beginning to cast a lengthening shadow over Asia. Rising power is emboldening China to pursue a more muscular foreign policy, as we have seen from a number of developments this year alone. I won't go into developments of the past years, but just the developments from this year. You have seen how they have tried to enforce their claim almost on the entire South China Sea, how they've tried to present the Yellow Sea as some sort of a exclusive Chinese military operations zone, and they so therefore loudly protest the U.S. intent to carry out anti-submarine exercises with South Korea, even though these exercises have been held, naval exercises of this type and other type have been held in the past. And we've also seen how more insistent they have become in pressing their territorial claims against Japan. And in recent months, the official PLA Daily, the PLA Daily, not the People's Daily, the PLA Daily has reported several significant military developments in the Tibetan Plateau, including the first major parachute exercise involving more than 600 troops to demonstrate the capability to rapidly insert troops in Tibet, the world's highest and largest plateau. The PLA Daily has also reported that for the first time, the new railroad to Tibet is being used by China to supply, quote-unquote, combat readiness material to Air Force troops that are deployed along the Himalayan border with India. Now, these military developments in Tibet have to be seen in the context of the Sino-Indian relationship, which has become pretty volatile, to say the least. China increasingly has questioned India's sovereignty over Arunachal Pradesh, which is a large northeastern Indian state, which China since 2006, only since 2006, has been calling southern Tibet. In recent years, China has resurrected its long dormant claims to Arunachal Pradesh. Indian defense officials have reported a rising number of cross-border Chinese incursions across the disputed and long Himalayan border. A couple of things stand out on the Sino-Indian relationship. The first is that the largest real estate China covets is not in East China Sea. It's not in South China Sea. It's in India. Arunachal Pradesh is almost 3 times as large as Taiwan. Second, through its various actions, China is signaling that its real long-term contest is not so much with the US as with India. And the countries around India have become battlegrounds for China's geopolitical competition vis-à-vis India. In that context, it is apparent that the US-China relationship is very important for Asian stability and security. But even more important is America's China policy, because how America's China policy shapes up will very much influence Asian security dynamics as well as the security choices of various Asian players. The fundamental US strategic objective in Asia has not changed in more than a century, ever since the United States took the Philippines as the spoils of the naval war with Spain: the maintenance of a stable balance of power. The security thrust of America's the security thrust of America's Asia policy is also unlikely to change in the foreseeable future. At least since the Pearl Harbor attack, the United States has signaled that America's security does not begin off the California coast. It begins in the western rim of the Pacific and beyond. The United States has been and will remain the main security player in Asia. Yet another aspect of America's role in Asia is the long tradition of a China-friendly approach in American policy that dates back to the 19th century. In more modern times, US policy has first aided the integration with the world of communist China, which, as we know, began as a pariah state internationally, and then aided China's economic rise. The fall of the Berlin Wall was not the only defining event of 1989. Another defining event was the Tiananmen Square massacre, which happened just 10 months after similar suppression of pro-democracy demonstrators in Burma. Yet, instead of coming down with a ton of sanctions, the United States chose a pragmatic approach towards China, facilitated by the Cold War's end. It sought to integrate China with global institutions through the liberalizing power of trade and investment. Think of the opposite scenario. Had the United States chosen the approach pivoted on sanctions, as was implemented against Burma and is still being implemented against Burma for the last 22 years, had the opposite approach been applied against China, we would have seen a less prosperous and a potentially destabilizing China. So China's spectacular economic success story owes a lot to America's decision post-1989 not to sustain trade sanctions beyond 1992. Whatever sanctions were imposed after 1989 were allowed to peter out completely by 1992. The US and China, from being allies of convenience in the second half of the Cold War, have become partners tied by interdependence, especially economic interdependence. China, thus, is very different from the kind of adversary the US has had in the past. Yet it's also true that the United States views with concern China's desire to carve out a unipolar Asia, an objective that runs counter to US strategic and commercial interests and to its balance of power objective. On the other hand, China's rising power helps validate American forward military deployments in the Asian theater. It also helps the US to keep existing allies and to win new partners and friends. How Asia's geopolitical scene will evolve. Sorry, but I kicked something here.
You made the point.
Just so it wasn't a bucket.
Yeah. How Asia's geopolitical scene will evolve in, say, 25 years is difficult to foresee. But there are at least 4 possible future Asian security scenarios. Scenario 1 is the rise of a Sino-centric Asia as desired by Beijing. China seeks a multipolar world but a unipolar Asia. A second prospect is of the United States remaining Asia's main security anchor. A third possibility is the emergence of a constellation of Asian states tied by common interests and working to ensure power equilibrium in Asia. And in a fourth scenario, you have several resurgent Asian powers, including Japan, India, Vietnam, Indonesia, and a reunified Korea. Scenarios 2, 3, and 4. 2, 3, and 4 are not mutually exclusive. Scenarios 3 and 4 can actually unfold even if the United States remains the principal security anchor for Asia. Scenario 3 of a constellation of Asian states working together actually is a very likely scenario given the present trends. We have seen a number of Asian states building strategic partnerships and thereby laying the groundwork for a potential web of interlocking partnerships in the years to come. Of these 4 scenarios, the least likely is the first scenario, a Sino-centric Asia, and I'll explain why. While scenario 2, America remaining Asia's principal security anchor, is a safe bet. After all, for the foreseeable future, no power or a combination of powers will be able to match the US in terms of power projection force capability or in range of military bases in Asia. The US has bases extending all the way from Okinawa to Bahrain, covering every sub-region and part of Asia, or in the number of security allies and partners that the US maintains in Asia. As for scenario number 1, China is hardly a credible candidate for Asia's leadership. leadership comes not from raw power, but it comes from other states' consent or tacit acceptance. In any case, China's power may be vast and growing. There's no doubt about that. Yet we should not forget that China lacks the power of compellence. It cannot compel any rival today, nor can it enforce its writ on the whole of Asia. Leadership actually, in my view, rests not so much on material power, but on normative power. That term came up in the last session too. And before our Russian friend asks me to define normative power, let me define normative power by what I mean in this context. The power of ideas to galvanize others. The Cold War, for example, was won by the West, by the US in particular, not so much by military means, as by spreading the ideas of political freedom and market capitalism that helped suck the lifeblood out of communism's global appeal, making it incapable of meeting the yearning for a freer and more prosperous life. China, as we know, has done a good job in assertively promoting its interests and in playing classical balance of power politics. But to displace the United States and assume the mantle of leadership in Asia, China has to do more than pursue its own interests and contain potential peer rivals. Actually, China is only reinforcing America's role as the implicit guarantor of Asia's security and stability. If you look at Chinese actions this year alone, they have served as a diplomatic and strategic boon for the United States in strengthening and expanding its alliances and partnerships in Asia. The assertive actions of a next-door rising power are making a number of Asian states look to a distant protector. While America's continued central role in Asia is safe, the long-term viability of its security arrangements in Asia boils down to one word: credibility. The credibility of America's security assurances to its allies and partners, and its readiness to stand by them when it comes to the crunch in times of crises, will determine the future strength and size of its alliance system in Asia. The policy choices the US makes on China will very much influence possible Asian security scenarios. For example, will China's primacy in American policy be an enduring feature, as the US State Department signaled last year, first by coining the phrase strategic reassurance, and then by publicly saying that human rights will count for less than security and economic ties. Also, given China's increasingly aggressive territorial and maritime claims in Asia, will the US openly oppose attempts to disturb the status quo in any sub-region of Asia? Or will the US be reluctant to take sides in the disputes between China and its neighbors? On both these issues, US policy has sent out mixed signals since last year. Since I don't have much time, I'll give just a couple of examples. The China-India-US strategic triangle, we have been talking of many strategic triangles here. Right here I'm talking of US-China-India strategic triangle. As in the period before the 1962 Chinese invasion of India, is once again at the center of the rising Himalayan tensions, with the fast-growing US-India ties prompting Beijing to up their ante against New Delhi. Yet, Washington has chosen to chart a course of tacit neutrality on the important issue of Arunachal Pradesh. But when Chinese actions in recent months have sought to challenge U.S. interests, Washington has been willing to send out a clear message, as on the South China Sea issue or on the Yellow Sea issue. It's important for the U.S. to lay down markers when Chinese actions not only infringe on American interests, but when Chinese actions seek to disturb the territorial status quo in any Asian region. After all, any disturbance of this kind runs counter to U.S. objectives, including the goal of balance of power and stability. I think laying down markers is important because respect for existing boundaries is a prerequisite for regional peace and stability. Europe has built its peace on this principle. A number of European states don't like the existing boundaries, but they've learned to live with the existing boundaries. When you have attempts to redraw existing frontiers, that is an invitation to endemic conflicts in Asia. In fact, when you suggest openly that you will not settle on the status quo, you want to change the status quo, you even make assertive attempts, aggressive attempts, you even make moves through your military to assert your claims to those territories, the message that you send home very clearly is that political negotiations are futile. Why have political negotiations? After all, in modern world history, a major redrawing of frontiers has never happened at the negotiating table. A major redrawing of frontiers has always happened on the battlefield. So in conclusion, I would say that a combination of scenarios 2 and 3, America remaining Asia's principal anchor, and a constellation of Asian states working together, a combination of those two scenarios seems the most plausible scenario for Asia in the years to come. But for the Asian security constellation of this kind to emerge, it's important to have forward-looking policies not just in Washington, but also in Tokyo, New Delhi, Seoul, Hanoi, Jakarta, Canberra, and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a very comprehensive and insightful view from India. Bob?
Well, I'll disagree with you, Doug. It was insightful, it was comprehensible, but read the paper, and I know you already have. The paper is even better. It's the job of discussants, as you all know, to say nice things about the comments and the paper of the principal discussant. But in this case, what I'm going to say is really genuine. It's a terrific paper. It's crisply written. It's solidly analytical. It's thoughtful. It's layered. It's forceful without being shrill. It really is. It demonstrates, I think, why Brahmachalani is regarded as really not only one of the most thoughtful, but one of the most influential strategic thinkers throughout India. As I was reading the paper and then again listening today, I was struck by echoes of the debate in this country about what does it mean that China is rising or re-rising, regaining its position on the world scene. And insofar as Professor Chelani's presentation and paper represents the broader debate in India, it seemed to me that it suggests how far Indian strategic thinking has evolved over the last 20 or so years. And I trust you will not you will take this with the spirit with which it's intended. But there was a lot of fuzzy thinking in India's analysis of world affairs for a long time, which is simply absent from this paper. Indian analysis used to focus on the brotherhood of third world countries and the virtues of non-aligned movement. This analysis, for better or for worse, suggests really that India, or at least the best thinking in India, has joined the global mainstream in strategic thinking, and its emphasis on power, on strategic balancing, and on all the other terms and mechanisms for analysis that I think is common, are common, not just to sort of realpolitik, but to what most people would agree represent sort of most solid type of analysis today. I think it's probably important to point out that some of the themes which you heard today, and even more, which are even more pronounced in the paper, are not necessarily reflective of the policies of the current government in India, or at least their publicly declared policies. The government and the Prime Minister generally try to downplay the elements of rivalry in the Sino-Indian relationship. I think the Prime Minister has been quoted on more than one occasion that India and China are not in competition. And I point this out not at all as a way of criticism, but simply to underscore that, as in the United States, India also features this very lively debate now about the significance of the rise of China. I expect that if the Prime Minister or some of his senior spokesmen were here and they were asked about India's most important security challenges, China might not be the first thing they mention. The government has said repeatedly that its most pressing internal security challenge stems from the insurgency which rages through much of the northern and northeastern and eastern part of the country. The Naxalite rebellion or insurrection. Naxalites refer to themselves as Maoists, but in fact I think the linkages between People's Republic of China and the Naxalites are tenuous or even non-existent. China really just doesn't figure at all in this particular challenge to India. Other Indian analysis would clearly highlight the threat to India posed by Islamic extremism. And while Professor Chellaney in his paper does talk a bit about Chinese linkages with Pakistan, and all of us, I think, would concede that Pakistan is, in one way or another, linked to many of the most egregious acts of terrorism against India. Nonetheless, I'm not sure that there are too many people who would argue that China is really responsible for the Islamic or extremist threat against India, or even that China has any real interest in encouraging Islamic extremism. Still others, I think, when you ask them what are the principal problems India faces, would really point to more domestic issues relating to poverty, hunger, an inadequate educational system which simply bypasses hundreds of millions of Indians. The fact of the matter is that notwithstanding India's hugely impressive economic development of the last 2 decades, large numbers of Indians have simply been left behind altogether. And I think many people would say this is perhaps India's most serious challenge. I guess the only point I'm making is that India faces a multiplicity of serious challenges. I didn't hear anything to suggest that you would disagree with that, but it seems to me that if none of this invalidates Professor Chelany's arguments, it does perhaps point to the dangers of overemphasizing a particular threat, including the threat China poses to India. As I see it, there's at least three potential ill effects of going too far in this direction of emphasizing the Chinese threat. The first is that there could be elements here of a self-fulfilling prophecy in the sense that the more one talks about China as a threat, the more likely, or an enemy, the more likely it is to become an enemy or a threat. Perhaps a greater problem or difficulty would be that too much talk about Chinese power and Chinese reach might encourage the Chinese to start believing some of these press releases themselves and therefore to act in ways that are profoundly foolish. I don't think anybody in India or the United States wants to encourage China to overestimate its influence or particularly its power. Finally, the third reason why I would warn against too much of an emphasis on the China threat is simply because such an emphasis might well divert both attention and, equally importantly, resources from these other compelling challenges that India in the one instance faces, the United States in another instance faces. Professor Chelany observes that because India has no formal security alliance with any other major power, it perhaps is particularly vulnerable to Chinese muscle flexing. He is not entirely clear as to what he means by this. He doesn't specifically advocate an arrangement with the United States, an Indian arrangement with the United States that's more formal than the current strategic partnership linking the two countries. In fact, I'm not sure exactly what the strategic partnership entails. I would note that India has a strategic partnership, its term, with Iran. Several years ago, it signed an agreement with China calling for a strategic and comprehensive partnership. Similarly, the United States has strategic partnerships with countries all around the world, so I'm not sure that's a particularly useful construct. But I think what is clear is that most Indians simply are not interested in a more formal alliance relationship with the United States. Nor would they favor, and here you correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me it's unlikely that most Indians would favor even a somewhat looser U.S.-India combination consortium geared against China, in which it's almost inevitable because of the disparities of power that India would be the junior partner. I just don't see any indications that this is what the Indians are looking for. Witness the fierce domestic debate in India over the last several years over the U.S.-India civil nuclear agreement. There was a lot of talk about strategic autonomy, almost no talk about the utility or the need for moving into an even closer partnership with the United States. The last point I would make on this notion of a closer grouping geared against China, at least from the standpoint of the United States, it seems that almost certainly the most likely reason for a serious escalation of hostilities between the United States and China would be over Taiwan. And I simply cannot imagine any scenario where India would find that a fight it would want to find itself into. The last thing I would simply say is that there's another side to this debate which I don't think was referred to today, but that is the fact that not only does China have vast and growing power, but it also has many and considerable and even grave domestic vulnerabilities and challenges. There is a debate, or part of the U.S. debate in this country about China is whether or not the United States is more at risk by a strong, aggressive, expansive China, or from a China that is weak and on the verge of perhaps instability. I wonder whether there's a similar debate in India on this as well. None of this invalidates Professor Chellaney's central arguments, that a rising China poses new and, in some respects, troubling difficulties for its neighbors and for the United States, which he rightly says remains and will remain the most important strategic player in the region. Nor does any of what I say challenge his contention that decisive U.S. leadership in the region will be an important determinant of whether or not China's rise is peaceful or otherwise. Nor does it contradict his contention that Washington should collaborate and work closely with friends in the region, or that U.S. and India share many interests in common, or lastly, that a close and cooperative partnership between India and the United States can indeed serve as a foundation for an era of peace and stability in Asia. It is, as I say, a terrific paper, and I commend it to all of you. Thank you.
It's the audience's turn. Yes, Fyodor.
Thank you very much. A really excellent speech. I have two questions. First, a follow-up of remarks of Professor Hathaway. If situation is is seen as so dangerous from India, the Chinese rise and territorial claims and a lot of other things, really, what are obstacles to follow Japanese way and to launch a formal military strategic alliance with the United States? Because that, if I understand you correctly, that would be a real response to what you described situation. Why this issue is not discussed in India or not popular? And second question. China, United States, and India have huge stakes in the future of Pakistan. Completely different interests. Future of Pakistan. What will happen in Pakistan? Not necessarily coinciding interests there. So my question is, do you see, both of you, do you see ways how to harmonize interests between those two actors about Pakistani future and as a connected issue about Afghanistani future, regional solution in Afghanistan after NATO operation will be completed?
Well, let me make two clarifications first. First, this paper that I wrote was in line with the theme of the conference, focuses on U.S.-China relationship. The India part is very small, intentionally, because I wanted to just focus on the U.S.-China relationship. Second, I may be the Indian view, but I'm only one Indian view. If you put 4 Indians in a room, you get 5 views. So if India is a country of 1 billion people, then there are at least 1.2 billion different viewpoints in India. So please bear in mind that I'm speaking for myself. Second, on the issue of US-India strategic alliance, it's an interesting question, and I think that because of the long years, decades of Cold War, but for that, the US-India relationship would have gone in a different way. But today, without a formal alliance being in place, the US-India security ties are developing very fast, faster than most people think. Now, just if you see the last 2-3 years, there have been something like $5 to $6 billion worth of arms sales. You don't see that in the press. Government to government, signed without any fuss, any publicity, no transparency, no bidding, nothing at all. It's not exactly a pleasant thought to do deals of this kind, but this is the way deals are being done. With which country is the United States holding more military exercises every year? With India. There are more exercises between the US military and the Indian military. Army exercises, naval exercises, even air exercises. Why do you need a formal alliance when you have this kind of trajectory in place? If you have a formal alliance system between the two countries, it will be counterproductive to the interests of both. It will unnecessarily inflame opinion in Beijing. On the issue of AFPAC, especially Pakistan in particular, I should point out that there is a clear divergence of US and Indian interests and policies on Pakistan and Afghanistan. And I think that divergence has been sought to be narrowed through detailed discussions. But I don't think they have managed to really narrow the differences on those two issues. India has had a long, traditional relationship with Afghanistan dating back to the 1940s. India has been one of the largest, in fact, the principal aid donor to Afghanistan from the 1950s. And it has invested in recent years $1.5 billion in building roads, hospitals in Afghanistan. India will continue to have a very central role to play in Afghanistan long after the US and NATO forces withdraw from Afghanistan. As far as Pakistan is concerned, I think if I just get into that topic, it'll open a completely new subject for discussion here. And I would rather prefer to stick to the US-China relationship, which is what the theme of the conference is.
I'll venture very quickly then into Pakistan. Ramachandran is exactly right. India and the United States simply see Pakistan through very, very different lenses. Sort of the short version is we see, the United States sees Pakistan as an essential part of the solution in the fight against extremism, whereas India, with considerable justification, sees Pakistan as part of the problem. And I think this fundamental difference really limits our ability to work together on Pakistan and also, in an important degree, on Afghanistan. Why don't the two countries have a formal alliance? I think the short answer is neither country. Neither the United States nor India really wants it. Neither country is prepared to designate China as the object of that alliance, and I think alliances generally come together when there's this perception of a common enemy. In addition, I think there's considerable hesitancy, as I indicated earlier, in India for other reasons rather than simply not wanting to overtly designate China as the enemy. Indians seem to want to work closely with the United States in many respects, while simultaneously I think many Indians still worry about being smothered in the American embrace. The last thing I'll say is Ramachandran may in fact speak for himself, but he also speaks for a very influential stratum of Indian strategic thinking, so don't be misled by his modesty.
I think we have time for one more. Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is Hui Yao Wang from a visiting fellow at the Brookings. I really enjoyed your presentation, but I have two questions. The first one was about you talk about the U.S. sanctions against China. If that had not happened, what would be the case today? Well, I would think that still, the better economic relations that really helped the world economy in general for the last 20 years since '92, and actually that China economy is also helping U.S. economy through the financial crisis. You can say that as well. But also, why not China and India, working on the economic relations? Because India is very developed on the service economy, and China is more on manufacturing. But Chinese manufacturing is actually having a lot of high cost. So a lot of maybe shifting to India. And there could be a China-Indian or Chanda or whatever, alliance economically. So when there's more economic exchanges, there will be less possibilities of having a war or conflict. So that's the question: would that be possible? The second question would be: you talk about the three scenarios, but you said the second scenario, which is the U.S. Anchored security, and the third scenario of the other Asian countries together. But these days, you see also China actually is improving relations with Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore, and all the overseas diaspora in that region, Southeast Asia, and also the Japanese and Korea talking about North Asia, Asian economic alliance or Asian dollars and things like that. So China still has a lot of influence there, and so it cannot really saying that that is not going to help the regional balance and attracting the those intermediary roles that China can play in the region, particularly also in terms of India and Pakistan, Afghanistan, that I would see probably more roles to be played by China in the future. So you can't rule that out, the first scenario, that there's still China has certain roles to play there. So that's, I would like to get your comment.
I'll take both your questions together because I think both can be grouped together. On China and India, you're right. But you have to see how fast the economic ties are growing between China and India. They have grown from 5 billion annual trade turnover in 2002 to $60 billion is the projection for this year. So there has been a sharp rise in China-India trade. In fact, China has emerged as India's largest trading partner. Having said that, what is striking about Asia is that the politics lags the economics. We made the mistake of thinking that greater economic interdependence by itself will help improve politics, help improve security. And we all emphasize that greater economic interdependence by itself was a good thing. But in today's market-driven world, political differences are no barrier to growing trade. That's the reason why China has booming trade, even with rival states, whether it's United States, Japan, India. As far as greater economic interdependence goes, the world was more interdependent in 1914, and yet we had World War I. And what Asia today is demonstrating is that while we need more economic interdependence, we also need better politics, because greater economic interdependence by itself is not a guarantee of moderation and restraint between nation states. That's the reason why the territorial and maritime issues in Asia are beginning to rear their ugly head.
If we needed any more, another demonstration, I think this topic gives it to us. Marx was wrong. Economics does not, or economic self-interest does not necessarily determine the actions of nation states.
Thank you, Professor Hathaway. And I think that brings our discussion for this panel to a close. Please express our joint appreciation to our two panelists. I would now invite Ambassador Roy to take the chair again and our other presenters to come up here for any final comments and a chance to ask any lingering questions.
Thank you very much for those very kind remarks and for your very detailed comments on India, which is very good. Sure. Agreed with your internal challenges of India.
Well, we have four. Gentlemen? Where is Simon down?
Simon's off me or Kirk.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. Professor?
Can you give me yours?
We're not simply trying to extend a long day, but I think there's been some very interesting views expressed in the course of the day, and I thought it would be useful to have an opportunity for the various presenters to have a chance to comment, provide some of their perspective on the issues that have emerged during the day. From my standpoint, one of the interesting factors was to see how close the interlinks now are among all of these countries. Russia, India, China, Japan, the United States, Southeast Asia. What happens in one part of the greater region now gets attention in the capitals of the other parts of the region. This was not the case 50 years ago, or to a much lesser extent. The second aspect is that my sense was that U.S.-China relations at the moment are not a cause of great alarm in capitals in the region. All of the commentators showed that they're paying close attention to the state of U.S.-China relations, but they're neither so good nor so bad at the moment that countries are altering their strategies in order to take the issues into account. One issue I think that perhaps received too little attention is the question, because we're talking about the U.S.-China relationship, there's quite a bit of evidence that when China looks at the U.S.-China relationship now, they see a declining United States. And they see a rising China, and that is affecting their behavior, and it's affected some of the statements that have been coming out from Chinese spokesmen in recent months. And we didn't really get a good flavor as to whether other Asians, whether Japan, whether India, whether Southeast Asia, or Russia, are seeing the same phenomenon. Is this a temporary spike in the United States? Is our financial crisis something that we're going to grow out of and resume our hundreds of years of vigorous growth? Or have we, in fact, entered a crisis period, perhaps similar to Japan in 1990, and a prolonged period of subpar economic performance is going to start to alter the power relationships in the region in significant ways? Our Russian colleague here commented that Russia's decline, if you will, has removed it as a threat in the region. And as a result, Russia is able to establish closer relations with countries in the region than it was when it was a stronger power under a vigorous Soviet Union. But one could perhaps suspect that a decline in the United States, if it were to occur, and I think it's too early to tell definitively, would not necessarily have the same impact on the region. These are some of the themes that one could extend from the types of comments that were made during the day. But I would like to offer an opportunity. Why don't we just go sequentially? Professor Takagi, would you like to offer some comments? And then we'll go to you, Professor Chellaney, and then to our friend Lugana.
Well, thank you very much. Of course, I cannot represent entire Japan, and I can just offer my personal thought on this. But as far as I'm concerned, these arguments about the decline of the United States is nothing new. We heard that before, and we heard, or we have seen U.S. recovery from that. And I think it's too early to determine whether or not current doldrum in the U.S. economy or quagmire in domestic politics is something which is going to last for decades to come. So even with the rapid rise of China, which lasted, as I said in my presentations, especially since 1992, unabated, I mean, it's still way behind the United States. And I think it's not too helpful to think that United States will stay where it is and China keeps rising and finally overtake the United States. I think China, the most important characteristics of China is its uncertainty. You know, in 1988, who had predicted Tiananmen incident? After Tiananmen, who had predicted current contemporary China? A lot of uncertainties and tendency to sort of defy specialists and pundits' prediction is the primary characteristics of China, I think. So based on this assessment, I think we should deal with the rise of China with the range of possibilities in mind. I think it's very important, dangerous to work out or try to work out single scenario according to which China continues to evolve. And so the further into the future, further or wider the range of possibilities, I think. And if we think in this line, in this way, probably the important anchor for stability is the U.S. involvement in this region and the U.S. involvement with China. And I was reminded by Dr. Paul's statement that with all the importance, with all the rise of importance in China, what anchors in the United States is its alliance system, and as such, Japan has an important role to play, and Japan shouldn't be too worried about being overtaken by China in terms of GDP, and try to reassess and rethink how it can be an important partner of the United States. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Chellaney?
Whether the U.S. is in decline and China is unstoppably rising is an issue that needs to be looked at from a historical perspective. First, in history, being large in size, whether in terms of area or population, has not necessarily been an advantage. If you look back at world history over the last 3-4 centuries, small countries have wielded world power. The imperial powers of the 18th and 19th centuries were small, in fact, even tiny states. Netherlands, Portugal, Britain. So just because China and India are large in size does not necessarily mean they have an advantage over others. They have to dispel that notion from their mind. Even today, if you look at Asia, small countries punch far above their weight. Look at Singapore. Look at South Korea, a country of just 49 million people. It has emerged as one of the world's industrial, electronics, and shipbuilding giants. The second aspect from a historical view is the importance of natural capital, natural endowments, your resource base. Again, the picture is not very gratifying for countries like China and India. If you see the ratio between their population and natural resources, hydrocarbons, water, for example, essential resources, the picture isn't all that great. But if you look at the U.S. Ratio, it is impressive by Asian standards and also by world standards. Third, I have come to not believe long-term linear projections. When I was living in the U.S. and I was at Harvard, Goldman Sachs did a study which was titled Japan, the Next Superpower. That was in 1988. And ever since then, my faith in linear projections has disappeared. It's very difficult to foresee what will happen 20, 30 years hence, because nobody was able to foresee the developments of the last 2 decades. The last 2 decades have been revolutionary in the world in terms of economic change and even geopolitical change. And if the next 2 decades are going to be equally dramatic in terms of economic, technological, and geopolitical change, then certainly no one today will be able to predict those developments. So given these factors, and given also the historical importance of non-economic factors in determining the eventual power and capability of a nation state, there are a number of elements which we do not see today. For example, will China be internally stable or troubled? If it's going to be politically troubled, in disarray, then all the projections that we have on China will go out of the window. So I will hold my judgment, and I do not at this point see the U.S. in decline. I do see China rising and rising rapidly, but that's as of today. What the picture will be 20 years hence, I don't wish to guess.
Mr. Lukyanov.
Thank you. 25 or 30 years ago, international system was actually very simple, much simpler than today. It was organized along the line of major confrontation between Soviet Union and the United States. Of course, it's some simplification, because even at that time we had more independent players like China and India, for example. But still, the main reference point to everything was Soviet, US, or communist, non-communist confrontation. Now, when I read different publications, opinions, or projections, it's a very clear willingness to restore old, good, simple bipolar system. Different ways to do it. It's a great idea about opposition between so-called authoritarian capitalism and liberal capitalism, introduced a couple of years ago by Mr. Kagan. Then League of Democracies against League of Non-Democracies. Washington consensus, again Beijing consensus, and you name it, a lot of different attempts to get a picture which would be very easy to analyze. Unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know, but all those attempts are failing because they don't match the reality of 21st century. And in this regard, US-China relationship, I agree with all speakers today, and myself, I said that in my presentation, that it's the most important relationship for the whole world, but it's not the only centerpiece for international politics as it was between Soviet Union and United States, and I guess it will never be such kind of centerpiece. That means that we will see very chaotic development, basically, in years and decades to come, with different countries playing different roles, and spontaneous behavior of different countries will grow, because the discipline of alliances which we had during the Cold War time, and which, because of inertia, continued for a while. Now it's over. Even inside NATO or European Union, you see huge differences. Or look at Turkey. So it's really a completely new situation. And my second point after today's discussion, everybody agrees that 21st century will be century of Asia and Asia-Pacific. Asian part of Eurasia will be a platform, will be place where main international developments will happen. And this is fact of life. But if we look at the previous place where major international development happened in the 20th century, the Euro-Atlantic area, it's a little bit terrifying, because in Europe in 20th century we had 2 world wars and 1 Cold War, major confrontation which lasted for 40 years, huge amount of killed people, destroyed economies, and so. I'm afraid that in Asia, unfortunately, we have at least preconditions for many such kind of developments, and fate of previous stage of world politics can be repeated in the new stage. So it's really time for everybody to start to try to avoid those mistakes, because having basically destroyed non-proliferation treaty and the prospect of 20 or 25 potential nuclear states in 20 years' time, I'm afraid that the scenario for Asian century might be as terrifying as you can imagine. Thank you.
That's a very interesting point, because it picks up on a point that Professor Chellaney made, which is that the wars in the first half of the 20th century made war unthinkable in Europe, but that the wars in Asia in the second half of the 20th century have left the seeds of potential future conflict. And I think, Mr. Lukiana, if you drove that to the ultimate conclusion of nuclear holocaust created by the proliferation of nuclear weapons, which is a nice way of diverting attention from U.S.-China relations. We have a few minutes left in case there are any final questions from members of the audience.
Thank you, Chairman. If you allow me, it will be more observations, 2 observations following the line of the very wise, I think, reflections which we had from the panel now. My name is Hans Maul, and I'm with the Transatlantic Academy, and I'm a European, as you probably gathered from my accent. The first observation is I want to go back to the very first sentence which we heard today from Secretary Steinberg. He was saying, if I remember correctly, from his perspective, the most important challenge for American foreign policy was to find the capacity for collective action to deal with international challenges which we didn't have yet. Now, if you reflect a little on this, this is a statement of absence of power. In fact, it's a statement almost of impotence. Now, he was reflecting in one way on the limits of American power. But you could equally make that statement, I think, about the limits of power in general in international relations. And I would sort of very much concur with him and come to, or just want to point out that perhaps the real problem in international relations today is not shifts of power, it's not concentration of power, it's diffusion of power. It's an absence of power, a relative absence, and China may not have experienced that yet fully, but if you look at what's happening at the Korean Peninsula, I think to some extent China is already experiencing the limits of its ability to get done what it wants to do. So that would be my first observation. There's a sort of interesting mismatch, if you like, between the perspective of a foreign policy maker who is concerned about the absence of power and our debates today, brilliant and intelligent and insightful as they were, but they were mostly concerned with power and shifts of power. The second observation I want to make gets us back to World War I. You know, as a European, obviously, one has to react to that. And you are quite right to point out that a high level of interdependence did not prevent World War II. But I would also like to add to that thinking in terms of balance of power was an important cause for that war. So the observation here is the way we think about international relations. We all tend to think about international relations as us analysts or perhaps even practitioners uncovering the mechanics of international relations, as if what we think were independent of what we get. I would like to turn that around and observe how we think and analyze international relations is probably going to have quite an impact on what we are getting in terms of international relations in the future. We cannot know the future, but we can try to shape it. And the implication here is, from my point of view, I have studied international relations for 30 years. I still don't know what a balance of power is. But I would feel rather more comfortable if we talked about checks and balances to power rather than only about a balance of power. There's a world of difference between the formulation of checks and balances to power, which is a notion coming from the American political system, to the notion of a balance of power, which, as I said, was one of the causes leading Europe into World War I. Thank you.
Of course.
I think Mr. Maurer made a very interesting point, but I think in my view anyway, what you should have said is not absence of power or limits of power, but absence of or limits of military power. I think some of us mentioned different kinds of power. And I think if, by power we mean the ability to move or change people's behavior, we still need some kind of power for forming collective action. And of course, most desirable kind of power we should work on and try to apply is a normative power, soft power. And I think we have a serious lack in this in the entire world. We are not able to come together. We are not able to persuade each other. And I think probably this is something where Japan should work very hard on. And related to this, I want to say a little more about the alliance. I think alliance does have the hedging function, so it is an aspect of amassing coercive military capabilities, but I don't think that's the whole thing. I think it has the, especially alliance after the end of the Cold War, has functioned as a way of working together with others who are not part of the alliance for engagement, if you like. And I think Japan-U.S. alliance as the anchor of stability in the Asia-Pacific region should enhance this capability or enhance this function and try to come up with better ideas together for working together with the rest of the Asian countries.
Thank you. Professor Chalane, do you have
Not really.
any comment on that? Any further things? Yes?
Mr. Roy, you seem to be, if I read you correctly, concerned about the decline in the United States, although you said it was the Chinese view that the U.S. is declining. early August, the center sponsored a Rise of China conference. I remember that Professor Joe Nye of Harvard, toward the end of his remarks, quoted President Roosevelt as saying that, quote, "We have nothing to fear but fear itself," unquote. By that quotation, I seem to get an impression that the U.S. should not fear about the rise of China. You should have some self-confidence. In the 19th century, an American journalist promoted the idea of manifest destiny of the United States. Although it was a catchphrase, it became a reality, leading all the way to the U.S. Becoming a superpower after World War II. Today, even today, U.S. is still the only superpower in the world. The other panelists' assessments are that it's not a foregone conclusion that China will eventually overtake the United States. So my question to you, do you still believe in the manifest destiny of the United States?
Manifest destiny is a loaded word because it's connected with the particular period of expansion of the United States to what we considered our natural borders. The way I would address your question is this. I think that the United States, which is still in power terms, if you will, the strongest country in the world, is the country that has the least to fear from the rise of China. But there are two preconditions that we have to meet. The first is we have to restore the credibility and health of our economy. And the second is we have to reverse the impression that the United States is a declining power. Both are important. One has to do with the economic strength that has to support the U.S. position in the world. If that erodes, the U.S. position in the world will inevitably erode. The second has to do with the perception of what the United States can do in the world. And perceptions can, in some cases, be more related to how others behave than the actual realities. Japan attacked the United States at the beginning of World War II without taking into account the latent strength of the U.S. economy. So it was a temporary victory, and it was a strategic setback of catastrophic significance. So I think if those factors are met, the United States has nothing to fear from a rise of China. But if those are not met, if we are seen as a declining power, and if our economy does not recover significantly, and if China is able to sustain a continuing pattern of rapid economic growth, then we will find it much more difficult to deal with China. So I don't think we can answer the ultimate question, but if you ask me for my opinion, I have great faith in the ability of the United States to overcome our present difficulties, and I think that the problems that China's rapid growth has generated within China will require a very high caliber of leadership in China if it is going to avoid future difficulties that could knock it off its present course.
One word. Countries in depression used to be very dangerous for all neighbors, and when they're in depressed mood, so feeling of decline, and so we have a lot of examples in history. So I think our need is to encourage United States very much, because and to show that United States is not in decline and has nothing to fear, because if United States will be depressed, and United States is a neighbor to all countries in the world, it's objective reality, so that will be very, very tragic.
Well, I think I didn't want to end on the note of nuclear holocaust, so I think that these final comments have left us with a much more positive outcome. I would make a final comment, however, that simply encouraging the United States to think that it is not in decline is not going to be sufficient. I think the United States has to show the resilience that we have traditionally been capable of and that it has to be shown through a vigorous economy. If we don't attain that, I think that we will have many difficulties down the road. Well, thank you all very much for joining us today.